My name's Chris Moreland. And this is going to be just a kind of a crash course lecture on Foucault, generally focusing on his theories on power, knowledge, and society. Yeah, I realize I'm going to be walking back and forth, aren't I? All right, so let's just kind of skim over the Wikipedia-esque information. Foucault was yes, that is how his name is written. It's French, so you don't pronounce 90% of the syllables. He considered himself a historian of thought, or historian of thought. It's difficult to categorize him though. His work is relevant in a variety of different fields. I've seen him come up in philosophy, mostly philosophy, sociology, of course, history, medicine, psychology, gender studies, and literary analysis. His general modus operandi was to identify dominant societal trends and kind of trace them back in time to create what he called a history of the present. All right, so this is just a non-comprehensive list of his works. We're not going to talk a lot about it.
Sorry about that.
No, we're here. One more, sorry.
One more.
No, I mean one more forward.
Okay.
All right, perfect, thank you. All right, so we're going to start out a little bit abstract here, and I'm sorry if you guys don't like philosophy, but you've got to study it anyway. The goal of any analysis is basically to describe reality, and in order for this to happen, we need language to describe our individual perceptions. Foucault said it's impossible to objectively do this. His argument is that when you try to describe perceptions using language, the end result is always going to reflect societal biases. In other words, truth is always relative to the society that produces it, which is a fancier way of saying that basically truth is whatever a bunch of people have gathered together and said, this is true. It's a really kind of paranoid worldview when you think about it. This means that Foucault is, as the second slide, I think it was the second slide said, a postmodernist. He's a critic of social theories and more general characteristics of modernity, such as capitalism, communism, humanism, and rationalism. Rationalism, incidentally, is the idea that truth could be found through discourse and logical argument. So he liked to poke holes in that idea. Most of his ideas, or most of his work, involves deconstructing institutions or fields of studies and how they aren't a product of to show how they aren't a product of rational thought or empiricism. All right, let's move on to the next slide.
Oops.
All right. So the first part of this lecture is basically just going to be his ideas on knowledge, and I'm just going to give you a kind of a really brief crash course in some of his earlier books, which are focusing on the nature of knowledge and the institutions that produce them. In Mental Illness, or Madness and Civilization, for example, he has several different editions of this book. One of them is called Mental Illness and Psychiatry, so one of them is called History of Madness. They're all essentially the same book, hence my confusion. But Foucault argued in this book that mental illness is a social construct. He tries to prove this by examining the history of madness from the classical era up through modernity to show how perceptions and treatments of mental illness originated from social, political, and economic interests. In the 17th century Paris, for example, the government decided to detain and hospitalize about 1 out of every 100 Parisian citizens. You guys want to guess why they decided to send them to the hospital?
Yes.
They were unemployed. So they decided that they were just kind of insane. That was the solution to the problem. Declare them insane, send them to an asylum, because they didn't fit into the emerging bourgeoisie's vision of a middle-class productive society. And so basically they just made up this idea that unemployment was a form of mental illness. And modern psychology, obviously, this is kind of a stretch, but modern psychology continues this trend. Psychologists inevitably classify behaviors that don't fit in with the bourgeoisie values as some form of mental illness. Foucault didn't really talk about the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is what psychiatrists in general use to classify abnormal behaviors. If you've ever been to therapy, you will have heard of it. But Foucault didn't really talk about that, but he most certainly would have viewed that as a means to exercise social control over a populace. Next slide. And continuing in his institutional critique, this is The Birth of the Clinic. It's his first and last critique of a more empirical institution that's not strictly associated with the social sciences. In it, he explores how the constructed nature of knowledge influences medical science. The emergence of the scientific method transformed European medicine during the 18th and 19th centuries, and rather than making medicine more precise or objective, his point is that science has turned modern medicine into a massive data collection process, an endless conversation about the human body. Foucault argues that modern medicine instead encompasses a network of terminology, what he calls the clinical gaze. If you guys have ever been to a doctor, they will ask you a lot of questions about symptoms, and it almost seems like they're playing a game of bingo. Like you have this symptom, this symptom, this symptom, therefore you have won this illness. And yes, that makes sense, but there's something kind of dehumanizing about the whole process, is Foucault's point. In the clinical gaze, it collects data about bodies through clinical studies, laboratory studies, and objectifies the human body, and then applies this knowledge, the data that it collects, uniformly to everyone. If you think about it, it is a little weird that data collected from carving up a corpse can be applied to you personally as an individual. Obviously, Foucault's not gonna give you any sort of solution or an alternate form of medicine, because that would be kind of weird, but he's just critiquing what's already there. So science, medical science, is just sort of reinterpretations and interpretations. It's basically just talking about itself rather than seeing what's actually happening. And when this happens, scientists can ask questions in a laboratory environment and replicate experiments in such a way that they will arrive at answers that reflect current biases and trends, which is a nice way of saying that a lot of medical science is just fads. I once went to a doctor who prescribed me some sort of medication, and I'm really paranoid, so I said, I'll think about it, I'll go home and Google it. And when I came back, he wanted to prescribe me for the same issue a completely different medication. And when I asked him why he didn't want to go with the first one that he talked about, he goes, I was caught up in the hype. It doesn't fill me with a ton of hope. Next slide. This one's kind of an insane info dump, but I just wanted to get the knowledge stuff out of the way before we moved on to power. Let's see. So Foucault's main topic, or main interest, was institutions and soft social sciences. This is because when it comes to social sciences, humans serve as both object, or the thing that is studied, and subject, the knowing sovereign individual that's doing the study. That puts us in a really complicated and tricky position when studying ourselves. It actually creates a lot of philosophical paradoxes that you have to kind of work out. Which is why, in one of his books, The Order of Things, if you had to pick a book of Foucault's to start with, don't pick The Order of Things. It's one of his most insane abstract books ever. But he concludes that book by saying that man himself is a social construct. That's what he says. As the archaeology of our thought easily shows, man is an invention of a recent date. So the social sciences produce our knowledge of ourselves, and those sciences are going to kind of realign or mutate over time, and thus our conceptualization of ourselves is also going to change over time. Let's see. So what he means is that man isn't just some object you can empirically study. He constructs his own knowledge, he or she constructs his own knowledge about himself using the social sciences, his own language about himself, and this language will inevitably reorganize itself over time to something unrecognizable to us. He calls this the death of man. At the end of the order of things, he ends with this really interesting passage where he's talking about the language of the social sciences. And he says, if they were to disappear or change over time, if something that we can't even predict happens that changes these sciences, then one can certainly wager that man would be erased, like a face drawn at the edge of the sea. What happens to a face drawn at the edge of the sea? It's going to get washed away, right? It's again, a really cynical view of ourselves. But, I mean, the sand, of course, the face is still made of, it still exists, but the idea is that data reorganizes itself. Which leads me to a few central points that, again, knowledge is subjective. It has no objectively provable truth, no deep, immovable metaphysical value. And of course, language is closely intertwined with the production of knowledge. I wish that I could spend more time on this, but it's not something that's completely relevant to power, so we're going to have to move on pretty quick. Basically, language comprises the conceptual boundaries of thought. The concepts and ideas that people come up with tend to vary from civilization to civilization, depending on the languages that they speak, which means the way you think about yourself is determined by, for example, English or Spanish or something like that. There's an interesting study that notes that schizophrenia tends to have visual hallucinations in the southern hemisphere of the earth, and auditory hallucinations predominantly on the northern hemisphere. There is not really a lot of difference between those two hemispheres other than the societies that are in them. All right, let's move on to power real quick. And yes, I did change the slide a little bit. Foucault begins almost every one of his books by exploring how, since the Enlightenment, society's changed a little bit. It's become a little less chaotic. In Discipline and Punish, for example, he noticed that a transformation has occurred in how we discipline people, especially since the 1700s. The image here on the left is a lovely rendition of an execution of a guy named Damiens, who attempted to kill the French monarch Louis XV. And as a result, he didn't even succeed. He wounded his shoulder or something like that. But as a result, Indians had a violent, very public, chaotic execution. They tried to pull him apart with horses, and it didn't work so good. So they kind of had to hack him to pieces after that. But compare that image of discipline or punishment with this, which is a modern prison schedule. My point is that in modern times, discipline has become much more regimented, hands-off, and concealed. Foucault argues that this reflects how power operates in society, not just prisons. He likes to generalize. All right, next slide, please. But first, let's talk about Foucault's definition of power. Where was I? Oh, yeah. Foucault interprets human interactions according to power relations, which is essentially who gets their way. This is the most basic element of human activity underlying Foucault's theory. And Foucault borrowed this from another philosophy, a German guy named Nietzsche, who in the 19th century theorized that human interactions essentially boiled down to a relationship between the dominant and the dominated, between wolves and sheep. Very negative philosophy, although he still has a certain degree of popularity on the internet, all the wrong places on the internet, I should say. But Foucault uses power relations as a critical lens in his theory. It views human activities as a series of narratives constructed to justify how and why some people get their way and others do not. It is a remarkably cynical, petty way of viewing human relationships. And I tried to emphasize this with that example about temperature, which is the pettiest and dumbest example that we can come up with, and I think it illustrates the point really well. Let's assume someone decided to set the temperature in this room. How do you think they decided to do that? Like, how did they settle on this?
Maybe their personal thoughts, what's a good, not too cold, not too hot.
Yeah, a nice average where they thought most people would be comfortable, something like that, or economic concerns, or they do that of ecological concerns, something to that effect. But you can argue that maybe most people in this room would want it, that most people in this room want it to be this temperature, but there's no logic carved in stone that says it has to be this temperature. It's just, it doesn't really mean anything. It's just tyranny of the majority if you said, well, most people want it this way. And that's just, again, tyranny of the majority masquerading as rational thought. And the point here is that there's no escape from domination. Basically, there's always going to be someone who's uncomfortable or stepped on. Generally speaking, if you picture a bell curve, it's going to be the people in the third percentile, like people who are really like using the temperature model. People who are sensitive to heat or sensitive to cold in this room are going to be uncomfortable, and everyone else in the middle is going to be okay. All right, let's move on. Foucault's definition of power is pretty different from what we're used to. The traditional definition of power generally involves wealth or material possessions or military force or some sort of political power. It's something that you can physically possess, something that you can hold and force others to do stuff somehow. Foucault doesn't deny that exists. It certainly does. I mean, if the president's going to order me to do something, well, you do it. But Foucault has a nuanced view of power and how it's generalized around society in a more invisible way. He says that power is the result of everyone's intention. I'm kind of blocking this for everyone. The illogical implication here is, of course, that laws don't really have any intrinsic value. Rules are empty in themselves, violent and unfinalized. They are impersonal and can be bent to any purpose. That's why during a political argument you have one side saying, well, this is the most reasonable thing in the world, and the other side going, no, it makes absolutely no sense. Like, we can assume they're both rational people, but, well, they have their own view of the world, and there's not going to be any reconciling that. But of course, his idea of the nature of power, it's decentralized or omnipresent. It doesn't have a headquarters. There's no Illuminati or whatever. Any level of society can wield power over other levels. And it's often more locally focused on the individual. What that means is he rejects like the top-down notion of power and says that the bottom-up notion can also have a lot of effect in society. The point, of course, is that power is a massive system. It's a product of human wills and power relations, both individual and institutional, coming into conflict. What this ultimately means is that power is not something that's with any one person's control or any one organization's control. People have strategies and intentions, but the larger effect of these are entirely detached from the original intent. Moreover, the larger effects of power actually determine individual intent rather than the other way around. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later. All right, let's go to the next slide. All right, my favorite example. We're going to talk about Walmart as an example of power relations. Their business model is pretty interesting. They have a great logistics system. When you buy something there, the purchase goes through a computer and a replacement is ordered. And when a product sells well, Walmart asks the manufacturers to make more. So, who determines what is actually sold at Walmart?
Customers?
To some extent, yeah. Like in an applied sense, the company does, but the CEO or whoever can't really ignore what the customers want. That would be really dumb. But so to some extent, the customers decided what's sold at Walmart, just not in a formal sense. But at the same time, Walmart shoppers, we don't all go get together and have a meeting and say, let's vote on what we're going to buy today, this week or whatever. It's a chaotic process that nevertheless has very real consequences and very material effects. And no one has a really clear, conscious control of the process. So when a product sells well, more people know about it, and sales are going to increase further, and it kind of becomes a self-perpetuating process. That's how Foucault kind of conceptualizes power. All right. All right. Foucault tries to look at power in terms of its visible effects in society, and these take the form of, actually let's go to the next slide. We're in the knowledge and power interaction section of the lecture, that's why that's transition slides there. So the effects of knowledge and power take the form of disciplinary power. And these are some strategies that disciplinary manifests itself in. Disciplinary power is basically just a bunch of strategies. Not necessarily something that we formally decide on, although that can be the case. But we see these pretty much everywhere. Like normalizing judgment, for example, is pretty straightforward. It doesn't have to be a formalized thing. It doesn't have to be just based on institutional punishments or rewards. It can be as simple as something like choosing the outfit you're going to wear based on what people think of you. We all do that. I used to come to this lecture kind of dressed less formally, and then I started to feel self-conscious about that as I kind of felt that I was moving up in the professional world. And I was like, no, I can't just wear a short sleeve shirt, even though that's what I want to do every day of the year. So I normalized and decided to wear this instead. And of course, hierarchical judgment is something that you see at work a lot. With supervisors and fellow employees, it's not strictly a top-down observation either, although it does kind of operate that way, hence the word hierarchical. All right, so I substitute teach, and yes, it is just about as horrible as you might think. And this strategy is pretty apparent. I supervise students, and teachers and admins supervise me. And it's a really kind of complicated process, you know. Like there's an art to supervising a class and wondering at what point I'm going to have to get up out of my chair and do something about whatever the hell the students are doing. I substitute taught for an ag class once, and I met the teacher before it started, and she told me that I needed to be mean to the students. That if I wasn't a really hardcore teacher who kept on them the entire time, they would tell her about me, and that would endanger my job. That was the implied threat at the end. She didn't say, I'll fire you, but so I tried to do that. I'm not a very good disciplinarian, but I do try. And as I was going through the rules with all the students, this boy started quietly singing to himself, "Why can't we be friends?" And what that song told me is that the teacher was lying to me. Because the students did not, in fact, they wanted to be friends. They did not, in fact, want me to be some insane hard ass. And that's why I say it's a really tricky thing, especially with substitute teaching, because I don't know what's gonna make everyone angry. Of course, the examination, objectifying the individual through assessment and data. This is actually the most important one, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit more later. We're going to see why this is one of the most important, most pervasive disciplinary strategies. But first, let's move on to the next one. Pick all the slowest animations possible. All right, so these are kind of some of the sub-strategies. temporal arrangement. We started to organize society temporally, roughly since industrialization. There are actual historical documents about people complaining about it, not wanting to be enslaved to a stopwatch. People don't like that kind of thing. But essentially, we are temporally organized. I could not show up in this room at 4 in the morning and expect to give the same lecture to you guys. Control of activity, similar thing. What are you allowed to do with your body? What are you allowed to do with the stuff that you are using in your environment? Are you using that stuff correctly? It'd be weird, for example, if one of you were singing really loudly during this lecture, but if we were in a music class, that wouldn't be so weird. You'd be using yourself correctly. And of course, spatial arrangement's pretty self-explanatory. Structures generally have a designated purpose. You couldn't really expect to go into a library and start a death metal concert or whatever. And conversely, you couldn't go to a concert and then start yelling at everyone to be quiet. I mean, you could see what happens, but. All right, let's move on. All right, so these strategies are important from the standpoint that they permeate almost every aspect of contemporary society, but they originated mostly during the 18th century and 19th centuries in institutions such as these, but again, they permeate. Note that they all exist to varying degrees in every area of society and not just at the institutional level. Like that, for example, is a classroom at a military school. I was going to put a bunch of pictures of like a military classroom, a classroom in an insane asylum, and like a classroom in a prison, but there's not really room for that. But my point would have been that they all looked exactly the same. All right, let's move on. All right, so disciplinary strategies aren't laws, at least not all of them. They can be, but there's an informal quality to them. And of course, they can change over time. Let's say someone was loitering outside the 7-Eleven. What factors do you think would go into the length of time it would take for someone to call the police on that person? Yes? Right. Depends on what they're doing. If they're just staring at their cell phone, that's at least a little bit normal. I think it would be more comforting than if they were just staring off intensely into the distance, right? And what about race? Realistically speaking, yeah, that would probably make a difference. Gender? Sorry? Yeah, it depends on the area too. If it's a really rich area, you're probably going to get the police called on you in like 10 seconds. Yeah, that's just how it goes. But you can see how this is not a formal thing. It's not something set in stone. Foucault claims the disciplinary power, and I've come to this point like 5 times already, but is generalized throughout society through a process called panopticism. The word panopticon, the word derives from the word panopticon, which is a prison structure designed to allow prison guards to see into every cell without the prisoner's knowledge. It's not the greatest illustration in the world, but it's what I can pick up on Google Images. The idea is that you can always see other people, but they can't see if you can see them, which means prisoners are going to modify their own behavior. It minimizes the need for physical implementation of power. You don't need to beat someone up every 3 seconds if they already monitor themselves. Basically, Foucault argues that we are living in a giant panopticon, figuratively speaking, where we're all watching each other, and this normalizes our behavior to some extent. While a lot of what Foucault has to say is pretty abstract and kind of out there, and I imagine the first part of this lecture is a little bit painful for a lot of you, it's difficult to connect with, I know, especially with the lack of real-world examples. I think he's on pretty solid ground here, believe it or not. we do live in a surveillance state. I mean, we're all carrying little cameras, I got one right there, and posting our activities online. And of course, we have, who's monitoring us? The NSA, advertisers, everyone. And like the NSA in particular is a great example of hierarchical observation. So yeah, this level of surveillance is pretty unprecedented, and we don't always notice it or object to it because it's not accompanied by physical repression. Like if you post something offensive online, there's a chance you might lose your job, but no one bursts through your window and breaks your arm and sends you to prison or something like that. But I imagine Foucault would argue that the hyper-individualized yet interconnected lifestyle that our people, our society allows to exist, let's see, allows power to invest itself on a micromanagerial level. I did not edit this sentence. But when I say power invests itself, I mean it's the effect of people pouring resources into anything that can influence human behavior, like an iPhone app or any kind of internet app. The resources increase an app's influence and popularity and diminish its creator's power over the app and its effects on others. So you can see power becomes kind of diluted and away from its original creator's intent. Like, I don't think Mark Zuckerberg, when he made Facebook, intended it to suck so terribly, but that's kind of what ended up happening. But anyway, power is less visible, less localized in specific institutions, and more individualized than others. Consequently, there's no need for physical repression. One more slide, and I think this is the one, yeah, this is the one with the video on it. So we can just play this now.
Okay.
This is just a brief video on the panopticon. It's nice and sets the mood for Foucault's vision of society.
Long ago, our ancient ancestors imagined an omniscient God, able to see all that we do. This God would judge all actions and punish misdeeds, either in this life or the next. Fearing punishment from this all-seeing eye, the wrathful God, devout citizens follow a system of morals and ethics, believing what the law was blind to, God must see and punish. Today, not much escapes the eye of the law. Cameras are perched atop poles all along the highway, on the corners of buildings, in parking lots, apartment complexes, and inside stores, restaurants, and offices. The internet traffic is monitored now, almost globally. Sets are being watched in China and India, stored and scanned in England, and heavily monitored in the United States by the ISAC program, an NSA-mandated complete internet oversight project enacted as a part of the controversial Patriot Act. Phone calls have been tapped without warning, and text messages are logged. Background checking companies access social networking sites where any number of acquaintances have tagged photographs of you anywhere and everywhere. Service providers keep logs of your internet use to create a consumer profile they sell to advertising companies and anyone else with enough money. You get nothing, aside from privacy violation. Aren't you being watched? There's no longer any doubt about that. This continual observation of the public conjures images of the rebellion of Big Brother. 1984 is continually monitoring a propaganda box installed in every citizen's home and work. It also makes you watch yourself, if only because you feel like you're being watched by someone else. Even if no one can see, you still fear the prying eye of your tattletale neighbor or a powerful government. You fear driving too fast because of speed traps and unmarked police cars. They could be lurking in an alley or behind a tree or sign somewhere. And if they aren't, there are cameras to automatically issue tickets. Officials even scan roadside camera footage to mail out tickets for parking violations when no one was around to personally take each other or move your car. This is the panopticon. First designed by the English utilitarian social reformer Click around in all the dummy cameras that look exactly like the real thing, but record nothing at all. Is this not a modern technological panopticon? French philosopher Michel Foucault transformed this concept into what he termed disciplinary society, fearing at all times the eye of the law. Because we know we might be watched, and might therefore be punished, we obey whatever laws are enacted, and even fear to speak out against those laws that seem unfair. So why is the panopticon an evil mechanism? Some might claim that despite violating privacy and personal liberties, that constant surveillance seriously reduces criminal activity. Perhaps, but in the absence of cameras, in a power outage, by cutting the cables, by masking your IP address or making anonymous phone calls in phone booths, crime will thrive. This is because the fear of discipline has replaced mankind's preference for ethics and morality. People fear the police rather than attempt to make positive decisions merely for the sake of being a good citizen. They broadcast their good deeds on MySpace or Facebook to show everyone how compassionate they are. Is this not merely selfish promotion in the guise of charity? Replacing the individual morality and the democratic evolution of an ethical system with a central lawmaking body that has eyes all over the globe and an unrestricted permit to kill and imprison makes a simulacrum of our decision-making abilities. Our kindnesses and distasteful and unethical behavior are delegated to others. Why think about what's wrong if someone else is there to do it for you? Why apprehend a criminal when someone else is there to catch them? Under the all-knowing, all-seeing eye of the modern panopticon, no one cares, and those that do are afraid to speak up.
Ambiance. So yeah, the panopticon is something that Foucault uses as a metaphor for human society. It's a lovely video for the mood, isn't it? All right, next slide, please. So these are just kind of some main points, but on a deeper level, power produces what Foucault calls the individual, by forming the body of knowledge that humans use to conceptualize themselves as individuals. And remember, this goes back to the idea that language forms our conceptual boundaries. And this is because humans internalize. Yes, it is. This is because humans internalize knowledge given from perceived authority figures and incorporate that knowledge into their own identities. This is going back to the examination. Remember, I said I was going to come back to that. So power is basically a data collection and distribution process. It's basically the examination as a disciplinary power. Of course, who collects this data? Pretty much everyone. Advertisers, psychologists, accountants, the police. I really feel like I'm on the wrong slide somehow. Anyway. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Power and disciplinary strategies give structure to society, but we do need to acknowledge the influence that they have on us. There's a book called Orientalism by Edward Said, and it talks about how after the French kind of took over Egypt, French scholars began to move in and learn about Egyptian history. The thing is, they learned about ancient Egypt and the pyramids, eventually translated the hieroglyphs and everything like that. And the predominantly Muslim population of Egypt at the time did not know about that, even though it was their own home, even though they had lived there for generations at the time. Imagine how weird it would be if some other country showed up and started explaining your own history to you. It's almost kind of insulting, actually. Foucault and Said argue that I should specify, Said was heavily inspired by Foucault. Having this kind of knowledge about a group is the same as having power over them, since they incorporate the knowledge into their own self-concept. Said noted that Gandhi, when he was resisting the British in India, he noted that the British had all these stereotypes about the Indians, and he was like, you know what, those are completely true. He incorporated that into his own little rebellion against Britain. It was actually kind of remarkable. I debated for a really long time whether or not I should keep this slide or not. No, I don't have any regrets though. So power produces rather than constrains the individual, and the truth surrounding the individual itself. I'm using this GIF from a Twitch Plays Pokemon as a visual representation of how power functions on the individual. A few years back, someone took a video game called Pokemon, the very first version of it, hence the black and white, and they put it on the internet, and they set up the game up in such a way that anyone with internet access could play the game, and only that specific game at the same time. At its peak popularity, around 120,000 people were simultaneously controlling this one character right here, which explains why he's spinning around in circles like a psychopath. You can see all this little menu here where everyone's inputting their commands, and this little guy, he follows all of them. You can consider him as kind of visual representation of the individual. Power and people and power are controlling him through disciplinary power, disciplinary power is manifesting itself in his behavior, which is still, I might add, it has purpose, it has an outcome. They did eventually beat the game somehow, despite acting like that. Keep in mind this is just a visual aid. Foucault would not know what the hell Pokemon is, and he wouldn't care. Just out of idle curiosity, does this help as a visual aid for his conceptualization of power? I once had a professor who used baseball metaphors for teaching political science, and I hated it because I don't know anything about baseball, and I vowed that I would never be that kind of professor. And then, like, when I'm writing a lecture, I'm like, you know what, I'm going to use video game metaphors. It's going to be great. All right, next slide. So yeah, this is kind of concluding thing. Foucault sees the individual as a collection of data. This is similar to the earlier point that the social sciences produce man's self-concept through language. It also determines normal and abnormal behavior. Behavior basically exists on a spectrum of deviancy and normalcy. Who is the most individualized person? It's the one who is most watched, the one who is the weirdest, and not in a good way. The craziest person in the room is probably the most individualized. Alright, let's move on to the next one real quick. Am I doing all right for time?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Alright, you can see the kind of negative role of individualization in job interviews or like online dating. They are both part of the data collection process. You can set up a dating profile and they will give you a very long questionnaire and tell you all about yourself. If you're applying for a job or setting up a dating profile, how do you want to stick out? Like, how do you want to show up? Do you want to show up as like the most individualized, unique person in the room? Does that sound like a good idea? Probably not. Like, I mean, if you saw a dating profile of someone who like says, yeah, I have 6,000 scorpions, like, yeah, that person's unique, but like, they're not going to get a lot of hits, hopefully. The general advice that you can find is that you don't want to be unique. You just want to be a subtle variation of an identical product that sticks out only in terms of being more functional, more normal than everyone else. You want to like speak the language the employees or potential dates want to hear, which is kind of, you know, it's killing individuality a little bit. All right, next slide. I think this is the last normal one. All right, yeah, these are just kind of the main points that I'm hoping you take away from this. Foucault's point is that disciplinary power is productive and organizational. It makes the individual and rather than constrains them, and you generally believe to some extent what power tells you about yourself. like, if you got a test back from Dr. Munoz, you don't like look at it and go, this is who I am. But it does tell you something about yourself, and you might modify your behavior based on what the test score is. Of course, there's a knowledge-power interaction that produces the individual through disciplinary power, and a circular relationship between knowledge and power. Power promotes discourse, which creates more data, which becomes knowledge, which feeds into power. This is kind of a complicated thing that maybe I should devote more time on to in additional lectures. But it basically means that there's not really an escape from power, because if you try and rebel against it, like if you start a riot or something, that's going to create more data collection. People are going to be like, well, why did you feel that way? And like it's going to be incorporated into how society runs itself. It's this kind of self-perpetuating process, basically. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Do you want me to cover the limitations, or?
No, actually, that's a good point, Dan, but I wanted to leave time open for questions.
Oh, yeah, perfect.
Can we get a round of applause for our guests? So, does anyone have any questions? Okay, because I do. I'm really interested in the surveillance part. I think that's the part that's most relevant, probably because it's the most scary for me. What do you think about the critique? What do you think about the argument someone would say about Foucault's views on surveillance? Sort of the argument that would state, well, if you don't do anything wrong, then you shouldn't worry about being surveilled. Like if you're doing the things that you're supposed to do, then who cares if your television can actually collect data on you, or the traffic stop is monitoring what you're doing at a particular turn signal. Like, why is that a problem as long as I'm not doing anything wrong?
It's a problem because Foucault's arguing that power is going to create what he calls docile bodies, which are just basically hardworking people who just do what they're told. And so when you say something like, well, I have nothing to hide, and you're just doing what you're supposed to do, that's the equivalent of being a docile body. And to Foucault, that kills individuality. Like, yeah, you're not a threat, you're not trying to incite revolution or anything like that, but you're also not really thinking or anything like that.
Well, I mean, I think this is important because you can imagine, well, maybe no one in this class, but you can imagine people in the larger community being socialized into this idea that, well, if the rules are this, and I follow those rules, I got nothing to worry about. And why should I care if my television is tracking my eye movements? Right? Why should I care? As long as I'm not doing anything wrong. It's other people, right? They're doing this, if they shouldn't be doing that, right? You shouldn't have done that. Now you're in trouble, right? So I think this is important for sociology because I think it does sort of challenge the ways we're socialized. The reason I'm scared is I don't like being surveilled. I don't like being surveilled, so I'm interested in some of your views. What do you think about the level of surveillance that you see on the internet or on your phone? Or the reason I want you to think about this is I remember being in an elevator with a student in SBS, and she was paying for something through her bank app. And I said, you just paid through that through your phone? So yeah. And I said, aren't you worried about it? So no, they know all this stuff anyway. and I was like, this is great. This is, I mean, part of this might be generational, but it's also, I think, about how we're socialized to think about these kinds of technologies. Do any of you have any of these worries?
Can I add something?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm paying for parking right now, and
No. I wish you had said something earlier. How much time do you have?
I don't know, my phone's going to let me know. But what worries me is that it's going to immediately let security know once my time is up, because you're only allowed to pick 1 hour. You do not get other options if you're a visitor at the school, or I'm just dumb and didn't figure out how to do it. But like it, you know, part of the surveillance thing, they're gonna know that the second my car is not here legally, they're all gonna know about it.
Yeah.
Right? So, anyway, someone else had a comment around here.
I agree, because the one thing I really dislike is when, for example, if I'm talking about something and it seems like my phone automatically gets popped up ads about what I was talking about, even though I never searched it. And
Yeah.
disable those things, because I just don't,
Yeah.
it makes me feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, I brought this up to some faculty members last year. No one responded. I figured they thought it was crazy, but I was like, sure, like, I said something or I Googled something and it shows up on Facebook or whatever. And now it seems more prevalent. I think there's even articles about it, about this kind of tracking. Yeah?
Like the weirdest thing happened to me this last Christmas thing. I had discussed, you know the genome test kits, like to test your DNA?
Mm.
I had had one conversation with a coworker and I only talked to her about it, I didn't search it or anything. Tell me why, like a week after Christmas, I get a present in the mail from no one, like it was sent to me from like no one sent it. I asked everyone, nobody sent it to me. And it was a genome test kit, exactly the same test kit we talked about, like at work. And like no one, I hadn't searched it, I never like looked into it, but I just said I really wanted to try it. And it was just sent to me randomly, no name, no nothing. And I haven't touched it, I'm like, they want my DNA.
It's not creepy at all.
Yeah, that is a data set that people are contributing to, and it's not like someone's just gonna lock that away in some safe place, like, oh, this is just yours,
Yeah.
right? That is data being collected across large populations of people, right, that are being measured for their DNA, and you can think about.
It could be sold to like the what do you call it, insurance companies?
Yeah, we don't know. I mean, I think that's also part of the fear. We don't know what a private firm can do with this kind of content.
There's like nothing illegal.
Or
for
they
business.
get access to.
Huh? I'm pretty sure they do. I always talk crap to my
I know they caught some like serial killer because someone in his family submitted his DNA.
Oh,
It was a really old case too. Somehow they managed that.
That's so scary.
Anyone else? Anything else you've noticed that's? Yeah.
It's something I noticed, but I was just thinking about what you said when people are like, what's the big deal, you know?
Yeah.
But I think those same people are like, the reason they are that way is just because of the surveillance, like,
Mm.
because that's how it's just how they accept it. I don't know, but it makes them become that person that, I see it's like cyclical, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
To add to that, I also think it matters depending on how much technology you had as a kid. For example, my dad did not believe in any technology. He bought like this new smart TV like I think like a year ago. And he never wants a smartphone or anything like that. So to me, like technology doing these things is just so extreme. My husband, on the other hand, his dad always had computers, had game consoles, is really into technology. So to my husband, it's like, oh, that's cool, you know, it's easier.
Yeah.
And I don't see it that way.
Yeah. It's easier. You've been socialized to use it. There's no real reason to question it because what could happen? Right? It's just something I plug into the wall and I entertain, you know, video games, whatever. Yeah.
That's why I get very paranoid and I don't buy a tablet for my son. Cause I just don't know like who's gonna hack into his camera and watch him. I don't know, I just get really scared. Kind of like Black Mirror, it scares me a lot.
All right. Well, this is good. Thank you again.
Oh yeah, no
Yeah,
problem.
thank
Thank
you.
you for inviting me.